Local history seems to be a straightforward idea. It's the history of a small, well-defined area. But when we deconstruct and unpack the phrase local history, we realize it's much more problematic. Local history, as Carol Commons states, is the, quote, study of past events or of people or groups in a given geographical area, unquote. This implies, of course, a geographical limitation or anchor. Local history must connect to a physical locality. Well, Common herself makes sure that she explains that such a boundary is merely semantics, but semantics can influence our conceptualization without us being aware of that influence. Your other authors for today, Kyvig and Marty, substitute the phrase nearby history. Moving such study away from the limits of geographical place or even familial relationships, nearby history concerns, quote, the entire range of possibilities about events in a person's immediate environment, unquote. Kyvig and Marty also consider nearby history to be a methodological approach. Although Kyvig and Marty reject the phrase community history, I believe we should resurrect it in light of ad hoc and virtual communities that do not share physical proximity for long periods of time. This puts me in mind of the value of histories of online gaming communities, for example, communities of interest that communicate digitally, and the ad hoc physical communities that arise occasionally, like Deadheads, for example, or fish fans, or people who attend Burning Man, or football tailgaters. Whatever we choose to call it, let's remember that we're talking about a group of people who share something that falls between the tight-knittedness of family and the anonymity of the nation state. What we're looking at can be called micro-history, not macro-history. When we define the group that we're going to study, we can look at these broad topical areas as fair game. That community's political history, its economic history, its social history, its religious history, its intellectual history, and its cultural history. English local historian H.P.R. Berg, born in 1900 and died in 1974, thought of the interrelationship of communities in the larger world as a set of concentric circles. I've modified Finberg's concept here to include the individual as the smallest unit of human experience. Bigger than the individual is the family. Bigger than the family is the community. Bigger than the community is the nation. And finally, bigger than the nation is the world itself. More important now with the advent of economic and political globalization than it has been in the past. Nearby history asks us to consider how the smaller circles interact with the larger circles and how the larger communities establish the context within which the smaller communities act. Let me provide a quick example of this provision of context. Although the borders between states are invisible, the laws of one state differ from the laws of another. An example of this concerns the laws governing the sale of alcohol in Alabama and Florida. Retailers within sight of one another across the state line on U.S. Highway 231 operate under very different liquor laws. Alabama taxes are higher and licensing requirements are stricter, so the gas station north of the state line sells only beer, while the full-service store south of the line sells beer, wine, and liquor for much less than you can buy it in Alabama. So ask yourself how this difference affects the communities of alcohol providers and consumers who have access to both states. Local history contributes to the discipline of history, which for a century or more has focused on the history of the nation state. Community history can shed light on the history of the larger entities. It can contradict trends that historians think they see at the state or national level. It can provide more nuance and complication to those larger stories. It also provides different perspectives, and it empowers those people whose voices are often omitted from our larger histories. But local or nearby history requires a different perspective, even to study, than what you might be used to. Even if you've not studied history at the national level, the methods you've been taught come from those used by historians who have privileged the study of the nation's state. There's nothing wrong with this. But think of local or nearby or community historical study as adding to your intellectual toolbox, not replacing those tools, adding new tools. Let's look at the difference in sources, tools, between these two historical foci. National history relies on professionally researched and written monographs, what you think of as history books. Monographs are always thesis-driven and construct an analytical argument based on the models of claims, assertions, and evidence. Monographs are vetted for validity and reliability by other professionals and publishers who put their own reputations on the line. We call this vetting, and even this editing, peer review. Monographs are also edited in a long process of inquiry that happens during peer review, correction that happens as a result of peer review, and copy editing for clarity. Because we as a community of practitioners over the course of centuries have agreed that such editing and vetting leads to a version of truth upon which we can agree, we also have agreed that an author who passes through this process of editing and vetting is an expert. That author gains authority. Academic journal articles are small versions of monographs. They're constructed the same way and suffer through the same editing and vetting process. A third source for historical resources that conform to the national history model are primary sources collected and retained by professionally staffed archives. Such archives choose and retain resources they think document particular histories. This is not an indictment of archival practice, but most professional archives and archivists consider how their holdings reflect or respond to broader trends. On the other hand, most professional archivists are very sensitive to other histories and other points of view. But ultimately, they have been trained in the practices of national history, even those who come from library schools. Local historical sources are more problematic and less trustworthy than those national sources. Rather than analytical histories, for example, local history authors tend to produce narratives. Many times they are neither professionals nor are they trained in historical study. For them, this is a vocation, a calling. Such narratives usually don't pass through a rigorous vetting and editing process either, and the author's reputation for accuracy is enhanced by how closely it adheres to the existing beliefs of the neighbors. When you begin working in local history, you'll find yourself using narrative histories, but also you'll rely on newspapers and organizational newsletters more than you have in the past. You'll use or conduct oral history interviews. You'll desperately seek and ravenously use photographs and artifacts we call material culture. And you will squee with delight when you find a stash of local records that work for you. Such secondary and primary sources make up the body of resources that you will confront. Gone for you are the days when you could find a couple of books to pillage or a batch of articles in JSTOR or even some trustworthy websites to get your information from. Now your powers of critical thinking and evidence gathering, as well as your gut instincts, will be put to the test, to use a well-worn cliche. On the other hand, you're entering an area where the topical fields have not even been cleared, much less plowed. Frequently, you'll be among the first few to explore these topics. It's a bit nerve-wracking, but this is where history lives. In conclusion, it's tougher than we thought to define local history, but we do have a pretty good idea about how to approach the work. Berg's illustration shows us that micro-histories act within macro-histories, and we know that local, nearby community history can benefit larger studies. We also discovered that the sources the researcher uses for local history differ from those you've been used to using, and that they are less well vetted and edited and even less available. But working the unworked fields is an act of creation that you don't get to do very often, and it does make an impact on the world around us. With that, as always, I thank you for your attention.